Welcome back to our study of the book of Ephesians. We are coming to the final chapter. It's taken us a while to get here. I was looking at the number of lessons we've covered, and I guess we've been at this about a year. So we've taken our time, and I'll warn you, we're going to continue to take our time. Coming into chapter 6, we're not going to ramp this up. We're not going to try to sprint toward the finish here, because Paul doesn't allow us to have just a summation. Paul has a very tightly constructed book here, and it gets richer with every verse. And what we're going to find in chapter 6 is that we need to take our time to really understand what's going on here, because some of the most insightful, some of the most life-changing principles of how the Christian life is lived are yet to be discovered in this book for us. But for right now, we're dealing with our section on the Christian family. The Christian family has been our focus now for several weeks. We started with wives a while back. We did husbands last week. And now we're coming into the issue dealing with children. And we're going to get to parents here in just a moment, but not today. Let me read our section. We're looking at chapter 6, verses 1 to 3. It says this: "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, and that you may enjoy long life on the earth." And then the next verse starts talking about fathers, and we'll deal with fathers and mothers next week. We're going to hold on to that. Verse 4 is all we're going to look at next week. But we're going to begin this week to look at the role of the child in the family. This is something we need to have an understanding for, because I want you to see what is going on here. The principles that Paul brings up are not just principles for children. He is talking about a foundational principle for life, the character we instill, the character we are pursuing, the aspects that Paul brings in here about obeying and honoring are lifelong principles. They are the principles we instill in a child, that they might become the principles that govern the life of an adult. So this is just a beginning point. We are laying down a character that should carry our children through life. That is our goal as we look at this. And we need to lay down a character in a constantly hostile environment. Paul, we looked at that, talked about that there's going to be terrible times in the end days, and we are in the end times. All of the time, from when Christ arrived till his return, is the final stage of history. And in that time, there's going to be a culture at war with God's standards in all respects, but most especially for the family. The formative unit that lays down the traditions and passes on truth is going to be a number one target of our world. And our world is determined to strip away the biblical definition of family. That has been its goal for some time. And I've looked at that. We've been looking at the last couple of weeks. We've seen the institutions, we've seen the plans, we've seen the goals, and we've seen the erosion in the quality of the American family. We've seen an erosion in the quality of the Christian family. And this is why we are looking at this in such depth. There's an old story told about how it is. I know Dr. Dobson liked to use this in some of his books, his Focus on the Family series, about a frog. You put a frog in a pan of water, and if you just turn the heat up slowly, the frog won't move. And the frog will stay there as the heat slowly increases until it becomes deadly to the frog. Now, first off, I kind of wonder about anyone who would even come up and think about using that as an example, or coming up with a plan. Let's do an experiment. Put a frog in a boiling pot and see how long it'll stay there. A little strange as a person. But however it got there, let's get to this. That, I think, was true at a time when Dobson was first doing his books and first talking about that. I think we had a culture that was slowly trying to change the game. And they tried to do things subtly. They tried to undermine the family in much more subtle ways. I know that there was an interview conducted with a number of producers of American television sitcoms some years ago, and they asked them about their process, and they asked them about their creative background and so forth. And what I found intriguing was this: almost all of them did not see themselves as creating entertainment. That was not their primary goal. The bulk of them saw themselves as instruments of social change. And what they said was this: they had found a venue that was far more acceptable and far easier to use to put across a message. And it was simply this: ideas that would upset people in almost any other setting, ideas that people wouldn't discuss and would find disgusting, you could place, and as long as they laughed at it, they would watch it. And it would slowly change their thinking. That was once the standard of our culture, but I don't think it's the standard anymore. I don't think the culture is content to slowly turn up the heat anymore. I think they see a tipping point. I think they see that they are ripe for a complete change in what is right and what is wrong, what they can define, what they can outlaw, even make illegal about Christian standards. And the culture is at a tipping point. And I warn you about this, people, because we have a need to hold to a standard that is becoming increasingly important. Not just for the culture. I hope that Christianity would move in such a way that enough people would adapt our plan, enough people become saved and change their lives, that we would see a transformation in American culture. But whether we see that or not, the responsibility exists for every Christian family to hold the standards that the world rejects. And we're going to find this increasingly difficult. I'll make it plain here. Paul's call is not a clarion call for a political movement. It is not a call for us to get out and protest. It is a call to take a stand with our families. The one thing that you can invest yourself in, the one thing that you have some control over in the power of God, is the family that God has given you. There's an old Chinese proverb that says this: one generation plants the trees and the next generation enjoys the shade. I'm going to put this to you. Whatever your background, some of you have long Christian traditions, and I've envied you that. I did not have that in my world. But some of you have long traditions where there's been generations planting the trees that now shade your life and give you some protection. But whether or not you have that, folks, whether you're the first generation to do it, it is time to plant some trees for our children. And these trees we're going to talk about here are the issues of character, are the issues that should change life. As we said, these are not just the standards of childhood. They are the standards that change adults, and they must be established in childhood. We have to plant some trees. We are at a time when fewer people are doing this. We're at a time when many of the trees planted by previous generations are being uprooted and destroyed at an alarming rate. And our goal is to return to a standard, to hold to something that God makes plain is the only way for you to see success in life and for your children to hope for success in life. And that is what we're after here. This is our third stop. As I told you last week, we talked about husbands, and I hit you pretty hard on that. Your crucial role was to be the loving leader in your home. And as we said, that is not an issue of barking orders. I told you that my example was that of the point man. The point man picks the safe path, and he marks it carefully. He sets an example of how to move through dangerous territory. He identifies the enemies and he avoids what he can. He confronts when he must, but he is the standard bearer for how a life is lived. That is the primary aspect. Yes, he has authority. Yes, he can make final decisions, but the primary goal of the husband is to set a standard. We then looked at wives the week before that. And there's we found that Scripture says their women are to set a priority to love their husbands and to love their children. God says to make that a choice. And I know what our world says about that. But let us be very clear. The world is lying to us about what really works. Character in our children cannot be created in a vacuum. And the role of mom cannot be farmed out. It cannot be contracted out. It cannot be given away. Quality, lifelong relationships in a marriage cannot be an addendum to our lives. It cannot be something we add after we've done the things we want to do and accomplish the goals we want to undertake. The world wants to tell you that fulfillment, that enjoyment in life is to do something for yourself, to learn to love yourself first, to learn to fulfill your goals first, and then if there's anything left over, maybe I'll let someone else in. Scripture makes it plain that the grace of life is a lifelong relationship in a godly pattern. And that is what we're after here, and that's what we're trying to build and understand, that having people prepared to live that kind of life, to grasp the grace of life, to have lifelong relationships that work, starts in childhood. The greatest hope we have is getting it right for them from the very beginning. We must create the character. We must plant some trees. And this is what we're studying today. As we begin this, I want to remind you of an important fact. These standards can only result from a Christian living a spirit-filled life. I've tried to make that the point again and again. It is ridiculous for anyone but a Christian operating in the Spirit of God to hope to fall into, to make these standards work. I also want to make this plain to you. And I've had people talk about this. Whenever I've gone through and taught on the family, I've taught on marriage, and I've taught on children, I've had this brought up to me. It's too late for me. I've already destroyed my marriage. Mine is shattered. My children, it's already too late, that they're out of control. My children are now grown and out of the home, and that relationship is broken. And I failed in my capacity. I failed in my responsibility to instill spiritual values in them. I'm divorced, and I can't put that back together. I want to make you plain. God is in the redemption business. I cannot say that by now, starting today, to follow these patterns, that we can erase all the consequences of past failures. But I can say we can change the condition of life moving forward. If you've had one failed relationship, why set the pattern and have a second? If you have an 8-year-old brat, why wait and have a 9-year-old brat? There's a time to change that. If you have adult children, there is still the chance to have input into their lives and establish a godly pattern as a parent that they can respect, and you can restore relationships. The capacity is here in the power of God, and that's what we're after. It is wonderful that the standards of God can become normal for us. And now I want you to see what God considers normal in the Christian family for parents and children. And I know the world has its standards. The world's libraries are full. You can find every child-rearing book in the world. There's thousands of them. It's going all the way back to the one that was big when I was a kid, the Dr. Spock book on children that was supposed to tell us all how to get it done. There are Christian authors, there are psychologists, there are sociologists that tell us how to get this done. God is going to boil all of those things down, all of those things that we want to get to two basic principles. Children are to obey their parents, and parents are not to antagonize their children by overdoing their authority and provoking them to anger. Those are the two basic principles here. And that may sound overly simplified, but I hope we're going to see how this works. This means, again, as we've started, everything is under submission. There's submission for the child, and there's submission to the parent for standards and for conduct. And today our focus is going to be on the submission of the child. Looking at verse 1 again. And this is a statement we all, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Every parent loves to quote that one to their child. You are supposed to obey me. Now I want you to note a few things here, because Paul has carefully chosen his words, and we miss this in the English, but the words he's chose here tell us a great deal more than first reading would do just in the English. First off, the word for children. There's a number of words in the Greek they can talk about. There's a very specific word for a very young child, for an infant. There's a specific word for an older child. The word here is the word offspring. There is no age attached to it. Paul specifically chooses a word that does not have a time frame, an age frame to limit this command. I want you to understand what that means. This aspect here of what a child is supposed to be is not something that stops in adulthood. This is an attitude we adopt. These things we're doing are offspring. It is command that carries through. There is always an aspect in your relationship with your parents where honoring and obeying has a place. That is not to say that it does not change moving into adulthood. That does not say that you have to obey in the same regard that you did as a smaller child. But understand, these are principles to carry through life. Here's the second one, and I think this is the critical one. To understand, the word translated here as obey is akuo in the Greek. It's akuo, and it's the word from which we get acute. And obey literally means, the word here means to listen or to hear. To listen or to hear. It is not a word that just says to take orders. It is a word that says to listen, to gain an understanding. It is to listen that you might understand and know why something matters. To listen, the ability to receive information and wisdom, or to be taught how to reason. To be taught how to reason. I don't know if I can think of anything in our culture that's more important than that right now. It's a novel concept today to think. It truly is. We don't even pretend that there's a value in trying to hear and understand what someone else has to say. In our current culture, we decide what we want to think and we believe, and then we ignore, we belittle, we shout down, or we intimidate anyone with the temerity to disagree with us. Listening is not a skill set. We are to teach children to listen, not just do what they are told. That is foundational in the family structure. We must teach children how to listen. We must teach them to seek out, to understand what is being said. We must push them beyond the world's thinking that just because I want to believe it, it must be true. And we must challenge them to look at what really is true, to evaluate based on a standard, to consider what is true, what is reasonable, not just what I want. Because right now, that is it. I decide what I want to believe, and I'm outraged by anyone who would disagree. I decide. This is our culture currently. We look at an event, we look at a person, we look at some fact or a truth that is laid out there, and we simply decide what we want to think. We decide just how we want to react to that, and then we are outraged by anybody who would challenge or say something different. And this is a completely different skill set. I challenge you with this, and I want you to understand, because God's truth can withstand scrutiny. I know we always get that thing. People talk to us about our faith, and they'll tell us, well, the problem with you Christians is you just blindly believe stuff. You just go out there, and because God said that you're all... We are taught to think. I would challenge you on this. Anytime God says something, I want the world to come at me and say, show me. Because I'll tell you, when you compare God's standards and people who live these standards with the standards that are contrary to that, the outcome is undeniable. And anyone willing to look at what is really going on, anyone who is willing to listen to the truth, can see that difference. Folks, we have nothing to fear in a world that wants to challenge us. If they want to have a conversation, let's have it. We can have it right now. We can critically evaluate, and our truth will hold up. There's a reason we have a constant flood of people lying about results in testing. We have problems in university with people twisting the results of their research and things to find answers because they want to find a certain outcome. And if it's not there, we just tweak the information until it says what we want. Christianity knows that God's truth will stand up. Our current culture indoctrinates and inflames. It does not teach. It does not want critical thought. It does not want young people who honestly think and listen and consider, because you cannot move people that way. What we want is a mob, not a thinking individual. And yet the claim is quite the opposite. I hear this all the time because I look at this generation, and it is a non-thinking generation. In fact, it's been non-thinking for a couple of generations now at least. That is where they live. And yet the claim is quite the opposite. I've seen several articles now that are talking about the most momentous generation our nation may have ever produced. People are making that comparison. There was a book out a number of years ago that called The Greatest Generation. It was talking about the World War II generation, its selflessness, its ability to come through crisis, to deal with a worldwide downturn economically, world war, and the things that they did and the sacrifices they made. And the claim is we have the most enlightened, the most understanding, the most purposed, and the most moral generation in America's history. I find that laughable when we think about that. And the current claim is it's because we have freed children from having to listen to the truths of their parents. They are now willing to challenge the roles of their parents and the morals of their parents and go to a higher standard. What standard? What have they determined? What thinking has gone into this? Tearing down is not building anything. Going after old values and simply rejecting them is not to come up with anything that makes sense. Where's the thought? And they tell us that we have to let children form their own ideas. Based on what framework? In what pattern? How have they been taught to come up with anything that makes sense? What process have we put in there? What maturing have we created? A greatest generation? I find it hard to see that someone who's willing to selflessly throw themselves in the camera is quite the same thing as someone throwing themselves in front of a machine gun fighting Nazi Germany. There's a distinction here, and it is ludicrous to make that kind of comparison. What challenges, what have they come up with? What have we created that has bettered life for anyone? What Paul makes plain here is that before children start making major life decisions, it pays to learn to listen. To listen. To think critically. To evaluate. To look at someone and hear what they have to say before you make up your mind. That's a big difference between how most of us talk. Most of us are just waiting for the other one to stop long enough so we can tell them what we think. We're not listening to what they think. We're not doing that process, and we must teach children to listen, to think, and to understand. This tells you something about parents. I know we're on the child section, but if children are going to be taught to think and listen, it is incumbent upon the parent to have something to say, to understand the process, to be able to talk with their children, to communicate, and to learn the art of communication through the years, because it is different talking to a 5-year-old than it is a teenager. To have the capacity to grow as you move along, to have the insight, to learn the language, to learn the illustrations, to learn the capacity to put across an idea. We have to start that with the earliest stages of life. As soon as they can start responding to words, talk to your children. Do not just put them in front of a screen so they stay quiet. Talk to your children. Exchange ideas. Share insights. Talk about life. Here's a novel concept. Turn the TV off and sit at the dining room table together for a change. Take some time to interact. Understand what's going on. Here's the next word. The next word is in verse 2, and it says to honor. Honor your father and mother. The word is tomao in the Greek, and this is a choice. Honoring is a choice. There comes a time when children grow up and move out. There comes a time when all the obeying doesn't apply, but honor goes on. It means reverence or awe. And I say this is a choice because reverence or awe is a choice. Reverence is what you choose to bring to your view of someone. I think I might be uniquely qualified to talk to you about this because I'll tell you, growing up in my family was a violent situation, and holding my father in reverence and awe was not really something that came naturally. It's a choice we have to make because of the position they hold. To hold a reverence for someone that may not have earned it. Now, I hope in all of your cases, your parents earned a certain level of that with you. I hope in some of the cases, the awe is inspired by actions and attitudes that left you in awe. But understand, this is a choice we make in how we view people. There's a beginning in how we look at this and why we have to do this. I'll go to Exodus, where this whole thing began. This is what Paul is quoting from here. In Exodus chapter 20, Paul brings out, Moses brings out and is laying out the law of God and how it laid out here in chapter 20, starting in verse 12. And that's the command that we're talking about here. But this is the 10 Commandments. Now, I want you to think about the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments really breaks down into two parts. The first of the commandments are how we relate to God. The second body of commandments is how we relate to humanity, how we relate to each other. And in each case, there is an overriding principle for those commandments. In the first commandment, so I want you to start back here in verse 3, and this is the very first commandment, and this covers all the commandments dealing with our relationship with God. You shall have no other gods before me. And then he goes down through that, what that means and how that works out. You shall not make for yourself an idol or forth or anything. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. All of these things flow out of that first one. If you put that beginning, the others make sense. Now I want you to the next body of commandments, starts in verse 12. And what does that start with? Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land and the Lord your God is giving you. And then he starts, do not murder, do not commit adultery, you should not steal. I want you to understand something. The foundational command that makes the others work is this one. If you have children who will honor their father and their mother, that will listen, that will obey, that means to learn the principles of life from a previous generation, then you have the chance of getting a people that will follow the rest of what is said here. That is what God was establishing. It begins here. It has to begin here or it doesn't work. This is the principle of proper relationships. If you want your children to have any success in life, it has to start by establishing this, or it cannot happen. How serious was God about this? How serious was God about the standard of honoring your mother and your father? We probably won't like this one a whole lot, but in Exodus 21:15, it says that striking your parents had a certain penalty to it. And it wasn't calling a social worker. It wasn't a reform school. You know what the command was? It was a death penalty. It was a death penalty. In fact, if you look down in verse 17 of that same chapter, there was a death penalty for speaking against, for showing disrespect at a level. Now, I'm not advocating this for American legal system. I'm not saying that. But understand, they recognize that no culture could survive, no culture could function with any values, with any hope, of any structure, if you let children run wild. Now understand, this was not for a young child. We're talking about a child that came to an age of accountability and understood what they were doing. But the action was swift and it was complete. It is not repeated in the New Testament. It is not a standard we find brought up by Christ. But understand this, it was a change that said you have to take control here or you will have no control at all anywhere. I want you to understand, this does not come naturally. I had an interesting experience a number of years ago with a psychology professor in the college where I work. I was in his home and he had two younger children. And at the time we were there and trying to talk, they were everywhere. They were jumping up and down on the sofa. They were knocking things over. They were screaming as loud as they could, running through the house. There was clearly no control. And he saw me kind of bewildered, looking about at all the tumult that was going on around me. And he made this comment. He goes, I understand you're like a lot of other people, but you have to understand this, he said. Children naturally are like this at this age. That's just what they are. We have to accept that and let them go through that stage until they move to the next stage. And this was his understanding. That's the way children are. And I remember telling him, I go, you're right, that is exactly the way children are, which is why we have to purpose to change that. That is their natural state. That is what they are going to do. Love administers discipline at it. And he says, oh, there it is. He goes, I know where you're going. You're going to Proverbs right away. Spare the rod and spoil the child. And here's what they always say. So you're in favor of beating your children. I found that interesting, and I said, no, but I am in favor of not hating them. And he was shocked by that. I said, read the rest of the verse, please. Because a parent who will not discipline hates their child. It is an act of hate. Why does God say that? Because love recognizes the natural state of a child is not something you want to leave in its natural state. You are trying to move them from one place to another. I've never been in favor. I was a child who was beaten. I remember the days at the hospital from the various injuries and the cover-ups that were told about the injuries supposedly occurred. And I've had no tolerance for that my whole life. In fact, more than a few times I've gotten myself in the middle of things because I cannot stand seeing someone physically abused. It drives me nuts. I simply can't leave it alone. But discipline must be part of this because it is not their natural state. You have to instill to move them from being a child to an adult, which means changing their natural state. Children must have boundaries and consequences. I've always taught this to any young couple I've tried to counsel as they're getting ready for marriage. When it comes time for children, make sure that discipline comes from a statement of what is right and wrong, not because dad finally got fed up enough that he isn't going to take anymore. It has to have a standard. It has to grow from something that says, this is who we are, this is what we believe, this is why we believe it, and you will be held to it. Start a conversation. I did this with both of my children, and I tried to make it a constant thing, and that is this. I gave them the right to question my authority. Now, that sounds a little strange to some of you, but I want you to understand how this worked. It was never allowed in the heat of the moment. If I had issued and said yes or no to something, they could not at that point argue and get away with it. I had to have control of the circumstance. And I told them this: if you feel that you have been improperly handled, you think there's a better way to do this, here's the deal. Set a pattern, set an appointment. Tell me when we're going to talk, and we'll set a time to talk about it. Come and make your argument. Tell me why it is you think I should reconsider this. Here's some rules to that. 1, we will not argue. We will have a discussion. 2, you will show me the respect for it. 3, once the decision is rendered, you will not debate it any further. And 4, whatever argument you bring to bear, one of them can't be because my friends get to do it. Our household, it was not based on what everybody else thought, but what our rules were. The reason I did this is I wanted my children to seek out the opportunity to sit down and discuss why I made the rule. Children don't want to discuss that, but if they think they can change it, now they're willing to talk about it. I even sweeten the deal because often I would allow them to make minor alterations in it just so they recognize that the process actually could work, that they actually were heard, that I actually was listening. And at times I'll have to tell you something. They got pretty good at it. And they could come up with a reason why I should revisit the rule. And sometimes their arguments were good enough that rules finally got changed. But the whole point was this: to teach them to think. To sit down and consider what the rule was, why it existed, and if it was going to be changed, what were we going to replace it with? Because the generation we have right now, tearing something down, they don't know how to build something up in its place. If we're going to change it, what are we going to put in its place? What are we going to do that's different? Teach a child to think. Teach a child to consider. Teaching obedience is to give the child the capacity to understand. We cannot have a generation that thinks it can have the world on its terms. We are setting people up for failure because they cannot control all circumstances. And when you teach a whole generation that they can do anything they want, it is bound to clash because no two people are going to want exactly the same thing at the same time. Damage can be done. A place I've often gone and like to study through is the book of Proverbs. It really is the parent's book. And it talks about the issues that need to be dealt with here and why this is important. And there's a theme that runs right through the... In Proverbs 1, looking at verse 8, it says this: "Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching." That sounds like a parent, doesn't it? Listen to what your dad says. Do what your mother says. It lays it out there. But it goes on. Chapter 2 and verse 1 comes back and deals with this. "My son, if you accept my words and store my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding." There's where it comes in. What is the instruction we are giving him? Not issuing orders, but building understanding. Why? Why is this true? Why does this matter? This is what we build up. Chapter 2, verse 1 and verse 7 comes into this one. "He holds victory in store for the upright. Be a shield to those who walk as blameless." It changes the upright. It changes us into something different, something other than what we were. Verse 11, I believe. "Discretion will protect you, and understanding will guard you." This is the instruction of a parent. Wisdom and understanding. Why do things work? Why do things work? Our structure must have a purpose. In chapter 3, verse 1, "My son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commandments in your heart, and they will prolong your life for many years and bring you prosperity." Not a guarantee, but a promise. It says if you do things right, things tend to work out right. There's a difference in how all this goes. Chapter 4 and verse 10, coming up here again. "Listen, my son, and accept what I say, and your years of your life will be many." The promise rolls through there again. 7:1. "My son, keep my words and store my commandments within you. Keep my commands and you will live. Guard my teachings in the apple of your eye. I like this. Bind your fingers with them on the tablet of your heart. The old thing of writing, putting them someplace where you can always know, to make some kind of reminder so you can hold on to these truths. And the truth is more than just Dad said I had to do it. This is what comes through here. Proverbs 12:1, coming back to this idea again. It's a system on it. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates correction is stupid. That's my NIV, and I think that's the accurate one. Whoever hates correction is stupid. That just lays it out there. I don't know how you walk around that. God wants us to listen and understand, which means, parents, we must have things worth listening to. The words you will find running throughout Proverbs are commands, yes, but also insights and instructions. You know what instruction is? Telling how something works. Telling them how to make it happen. That is the role. A child must be prepared to understand that. The world wants to try to liberate children. I find that amazing. There was a Year of the Child statement by Gloria Steinem that put out this. It says we have to change the lives of children so we can end the cycle of bigotry, sexual abuse, and religious indoctrination. This, she said, is what must stop. That's been their goal, and that was a statement made in 1979, and it has not changed since. That is what they're after. Liberation from parents. A landmark case happened in Nebraska some years ago. A pastor had his daughter attending a local high school and did not want her to go to the school dance. The school psychologist determined that this was child abuse and had the daughter removed from the man's home. And a court upheld it. And in order to have his daughter returned to his home, he had to agree not to abuse her in such a way again by denying her access to the things she wanted to experience in school. It is amazing where we're going. Children are not ready to be liberated. There's a simple reason for this. They are children. They are not ready to control your life. Even Jesus went through the process of growth. You can look at that in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, where it simply says, he grew in stature before God and man. There are 4 things that your children must grow in. There are 4 things they are lacking when they enter this world. They lack wisdom, they lack physical stature, and they lack favor with God and favor with man. And these are the things that we are there to help them walk through and change. And think about this. No matter your children, no matter how cute, no matter how smart, are born ignorant. They are born without the basic distinction of understanding. They have no knowledge. They lack even the basic restraint to avoid injury. Isn't that a fact? Come on. We have to baby-proof our house. We have to go through these things. The child is not prepared to understand. They do not understand right and wrong. It is your job to change that. They are small. They are weak. They are susceptible. They are not prepared to protect themselves in this world. And your parental role is there to do that. And a child needs to understand and be made to understand that protection is necessary. It is not a safe world. They are the targets of some of the worst people on the planet because they are susceptible. But 2 things they have to understand is they need to grow in stature before man and before God. Parents, this is your role to make that happen. Children need to learn to grow in stature before man. Let's face it, little children are an embarrassment waiting to happen, aren't they? They will do anything. They have no sense of what not to say or when to say it. How many times have you had your child pipe up and say something that you're just cringing and you're time to get out of here? They don't understand. They don't. And they need to be made to understand. That words mean something. That attitudes mean something. And the manner in which they treat people matters. They have to grow in stature before God. You must create the spiritual environment that will save their souls. You need to create that for them. The command is to train them up in the way they shall go, and they won't depart from it, is our statement in Scripture. Now I want you to understand, that is not an ironclad promise from God. That is the simple statement that says this. Preparing them right gives them the best chance of living a good life. If you want them to have a chance to make it work, build that up. Don't do that, and you have a problem. People with no concept of respect for authority are not prepared for life, and they disrupt the entirety of a culture. A number of schools across the country have stated how hard it is to get teachers to want to take classes with older students, especially in junior high and high school. Why? The teachers are literally afraid of their students. They're afraid of what they've become, and they have no control. Teach them obedience. Do the greatest favor of their lives. Give them a fighting chance for stable marriages, decent jobs, and long-lasting friendships by impacting them with what is true. Teach them to listen and to think. Many of you may have in your home the statement from Joshua 24:15. I know we have it hanging out in the front room of our place. Choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Please understand, this is the statement of a family, the one place you have the capacity to control that. It's not the statement for a culture. It's not the statement for a nation. It's the statement for a people. Why do we obey? Go back to Ephesians chapter 6 and take a look at this. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It's right. How do we know it's right? Well, Scripture makes that pretty plain. Right there it says, because this is right. Psalm 119:8 says, the precepts of the Lord are right. Psalm 119:75 says, I know, O Lord, that your laws are right. And in verse 128 of the same chapter it says, I consider all your precepts right. You can find that same statement in Nehemiah chapter 9, Hosea chapter 12, and Romans chapter 12. You know why it's right? Here's what we're going to say. Because God says it is. God has the unique capacity to know it's right because he decides what's right. We can go through everything and show you that it works, but you have to begin with the discipline that says this. God says it's right. That's what I need to do. Paul refers to the 10 Commandments here when he says, honor your father and mother. Obey is the action. Honor is the attitude. And God is always concerned with the attitude. Instilling the ability to think is to go after the heart of a child. Yes, you have to control the conduct, but long-term control of conduct only holds if you've worked on the heart. And we can't get them there if we just make them obey. Please, make them think. And I put this out to the younger people that might be listening to this. Think. Pause. Consider. Listen. Learn to listen. It will change everything in your life if you learn to listen. You can learn so much. You can gain so much. You can change relationships. You can change conditions of your life if you're willing to listen. If you're willing to choose a character that says, this is how I'm going to treat the most important people in my life. I'm going to choose to honor them. I'm going to choose to obey. Next week, we'll start talking about the parents' role in all of this, go into that more deeply. For now, this is the standard for children.